On December 26th, 2021, I stood in this pulpit as your minister and delivered a sermon titled Sharing Joy. It is quite typical for the attendance at a service on the Sunday after Christmas to be low, but the attendance that day was very low. There were 3 people in attendance here in the sanctuary that day: the lay leader, the person running the live stream back in the back, and me. Along with the 3 of us, there were 23 computer screens live streaming the service. The fact that it was the day after Christmas wasn't the only reason for the low attendance. As you may remember, the COVID pandemic was ending its 2nd year of death and destruction back then. And even though a significant portion of the population had received vaccinations, the disease was still a very significant threat to the health and well-being of many people. For the protection of the UUFB community, the board had closed the building to nearly all in-person activities, including services. If you wanted to attend a UUFB service in 2021, the only option was to view it online. After more than 18 months of not having in-person services, online attendance had been in decline for a while. Those were some pretty tough times. When your current minister requested that I offer the Sharing Joy sermon again, I was grateful for the opportunity to do so. After reviewing the sermon, however, it became clear that some changes were needed in order for it to be more relevant to today. I've left the main elements of the sermon intact, so if you were attending the service online that day, much of what I'm going to share today will sound familiar. Whether it seems familiar or not, I hope what I have to offer this morning provides hope and inspiration during the difficult times we are living in today. COVID is still in our midst, but it isn't the singular threat to our personal and collective well-being it was less than 4 years ago. Today, the virus is killing people in this country by the thousands each month, instead of by the tens of thousands as it was in December of 2021. Yet, while the threat COVID poses is significantly less than it was, many people continue to find it difficult to feel joy today. The reason for this, I believe, is that we are now facing multiple significant threats instead of primarily one. I will mention just a few of these threats, the first 2 of which are much larger threats than the COVID pandemic. First, global climate change continues to accelerate. As a result, drought and severe storms intensify, and wildfires are more frequent and often more destructive. The good news is that more and more people are acknowledging that global climate change is real and a significant threat to all people. Second, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists announced in late January that the world is now closer to nuclear war than it was since 1947. And then there are threats which are less global but still very concerning. I will mention just a few. There's the current threat to the democratic form of government in this country. There are the mass layoffs and firings of federal employees. There are financial cuts to non-federal programs, including research programs. There's the increasing likelihood of a trade war triggered by tariffs. And then there is the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and programs. I could go on, but I will stop here. Considering the threats I just mentioned, is it any wonder that many of us are living below the line that Reverend Orlinda Worthington spoke of during her sermon on March 2nd? If you haven't yet heard her sermon, I encourage you to go to the UUFB website to view the recording of it. Today, life may be so uncertain, challenging, upsetting, or even painful that experiencing joy could seem unimaginable. Or maybe you can imagine joy, but only as a memory from some other better time in your life. I chose today's reading, the same reading that was shared during the December 26, 2021 service, because joy seems difficult for so many of us to find, to feel, and to pass on. The reading speaks clearly and directly to living with pain and difficulty, while also holding out hope and the expectation for joy. In the book our reading comes from, Valerie Kaur writes in some detail about spending time at the bedside of her good friend Joyce, who was a mother figure for her. Joyce had multiple myeloma, a type of cancer found in the plasma cells in a person's bones. The night before Joyce's death, Valerie sat at her bedside holding her hand. Valerie was there as Joyce took her final labored breath. Upon realizing that Joyce was no longer alive, Kaur began to weep. She was filled with grief. Yet, even in her grief, she did what she had promised Joyce she would do. Joyce was, as Kaur is, a member of the Sikh religious tradition. As per Sikh custom and Joyce's request, Kaur began gently washing Joyce's body as a first step in preparation for burial. Kaur writes that she washed the body of her now deceased friend through her tears. The following morning, Kaur became aware that she was pregnant. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had experienced the ending of a life. She felt and continued to feel the pain and grief of that loss. And in just a few months, she would bring new life into existence and feel both the pain and the joy of birth. As we heard in our reading, joy is possible even in the great labors, the labor of dying, the labor of birthing, and the labors in between. I mention Kaur's religion for a reason. I mention it to illustrate that religious traditions other than the predominant religion in this country, namely Christianity, lift up the significance and importance of joy. Numerous religious traditions encourage or even implore their followers to seek and share joy. I know some of you have seen the film Mission Joy, Finding Happiness in Troubled Time. The film is a documentary of the friendship between His Holiness the Dalai Lama, a Buddhist, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a Christian. The film was inspired by the book titled The Book of Joy, Lasting Happiness in a Changing World, which was a New York Times bestseller. In the film, both of these icons of their religious faith traditions spoke about and exuded joy. They shared the importance joy holds in their beliefs, in their faith traditions, and in their lives. And in the film, both shared about the difficulties, the hardships, and the suffering they went through at various points in their lives. Both men made it clear that the difficulties, hardships, and suffering made it possible for them to feel the level of joy they were able to experience in their lives at that time. I will offer a couple of examples so those of you who haven't seen the film can get an idea of the types of difficulties, hardships, and suffering they experienced. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, was taken from his family when he was a very young child to live in a Buddhist temple in Tibet. There, he was taught by the monks in the monastery in preparation for him to be the 14th Dalai Lama, the religious leader of Tibetan Buddhism. Once at the monastery, he never again experienced the nurturing or the love of his mother. And in his early adult years, he was forced to leave Tibet as the Chinese army invaded and took over the country of his birth. He has lived in exile ever since. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu spent years in a South African prison for speaking out bravely and eloquently against the systemic racism often referred to as apartheid in his country. Both men shared about the pain and suffering these experiences brought to their lives. And both shared that it was not in spite of these experiences that they feel joyful. Instead, it was because of these experiences that they can feel deep joy. Each told of how these experiences opened their eyes, their senses, and their hearts to a level of joy that would not have been possible without the pain and suffering they faced. I found it especially moving when the two men agreed that joy is essential to their well-being and the well-being of all humans. Both also talked of the importance of joy in their religious faith traditions. While there are some major areas between their two religious faith traditions where beliefs are quite different, the significance and importance of joy was an area where they shared common ground. If you haven't seen this film, I encourage you to take the time to watch it. It is available on Netflix. There was a very significant event I wasn't aware of the day I delivered the sermon, Sharing Joy. On December 26, 2021, Desmond Tutu took his final breath. I find it to be quite an amazing coincidence that on the day of his death, I was sharing his message with the members and friends of this congregation. And I was lifting it up and passing it on halfway around the world. as his life came to an end. I believe, had he known that, he would have been filled with joy. By now, I hope I've made it clear that the challenging times we are living in do not preclude the possibility of encountering and experiencing joy. The challenging times, the times of great labor, as Valerie Kaur puts it, are the times that present the soil, that prepare the soil of our soul for an even greater harvest of joy than otherwise would have been possible. In my own life, the concept of a greater harvest of joy is exemplified by the following experience from my childhood and youth. As I've shared with some of you in the past, I grew up in a small town that was surrounded by agricultural land. Most of the land was planted in crops such as corn, beans, wheat, and pickles. There were also a few folks who raised livestock. One such place was a dairy farm that was less than 2 miles from the center of town. Whenever the wind was out of the southwest, the smell in the air reminded everyone in town of the dairy farm's existence. But that wasn't the only time people were made aware of the dairy farm. Every spring, the dairy farm would offer the large mounds of manure that had built up over the winter to local crop farmers. The crop farmers would then spread it on their fields to enhance the fertility of their soil. I recall as a youth thinking that spreading the manure had to be the worst possible job imaginable. And yet, because of those who did the spreading, the crops grown on the land thrived. The son of the dairy farm owner played trombone, as did I, in the high school band. He once told me that his father never sold the manure. He shared it for free with other farmers in the area. In return, the farmers who had the manure spread on their fields would share a portion of their crops with the dairy owner and his family. The manure from that dairy farm helped nourish the soil, which then grew crops more abundantly. The local farmers, the dairy owner's family, as well as many others in the community benefited from the food that was produced. The sharing and spreading of the manure eventually led to the sharing and spreading of good food, as well as goodwill in the community. With all that is occurring in the world and in our country today, there is far more fear, anguish, pain, and loss than any of us would want. We certainly don't need any more. What we need is to find the joys that exist even in the midst of the really awful parts of life, of the manure that life is presenting and spreading all around us. And when we find those joys, we need to do what we can to spread them, to share them, just as the farmers in my home community shared the nourishing crops they grew with the dairy farmer and others. As we experience and spread joy freely and openly, we may bring a smile to another's face. We may offer hope to someone who has been lacking it. Finding and then spreading joy is one way we can express and encourage goodwill towards all people. In closing, let us hear again the words and the wisdom of Valerie Cower. I believe laboring in joy is the meaning of life. May we look up at that night sky. May we let joy in. For we will be someone's ancestors one day. If we do this right, they will inherit not our fear, but bravery born of joy. So may it be.